Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're in chapter 5, verses 8 and 9 today. Let me just go ahead and read them. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there is yet a higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. We mentioned last time we were together that in this section, beginning in chapter 5, we're getting to a very dark place, and we talked about two things. We talked about the fact that Solomon makes it clear in chapter 1 that he's taking eternal justice out of the equation, that he's limiting everything to what happens here under the sun. And it's important that he does that. It's continually important that he does that, because there are people who believe that. People who do not believe in a God or an afterlife believe that all we have is what we have here. And if that's what we're left with, then this is true. This is the way life is. And there's no reason not to see everything just as darkly as he's seeing it. And it's almost like in It's a Wonderful Life, when Jimmy Stewart gets to see what life would be like if he had never been in it. We're getting to see what life would be like if there was no promise of eternity and no eternal justice. If the only choice we have is the choice between life and death, not the choice between heaven and hell. We also talked about the way biblical writers can look at the same set of facts and come away with not necessarily different conclusions, or draw or have different sets of facts, but have a different attitude towards the same set of facts. And I said, if you want to see the perfect example of this, to compare Psalm 90 with Psalm 103. Psalm of Moses, Psalm of David. David quotes Psalm 90 in Psalm 103 in response to it. And he's much more positive. There's much more light and hope in Psalm 103 than there is in Psalm 90 from Abraham. Or excuse me, from Moses. And so we didn't want to mention that. One other thing, this section is difficult to translate, particularly these early verses of chapter 5. And so I'm reading from the ESV. Your version might vary widely. I don't always agree with the way the ESV translates, but I think in these two verses today, they've done the best job of any translation that I know, because it makes sense. It makes sense. It's logical, what is being said. Let's think about verse 8. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, don't be amazed. Why? Because the high official has one higher than him, and he has one higher than him. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, we know that quote so well. Is it Lord North or Lord Acton? Anyway, we know that quote so well about the corrupting nature of power. And so we have power to the third degree. We have power cubed here, and corruption cubed here. So if there are, for every level of power there is a level of corruption. That's particularly true if there's no promise of heaven or threat of hell. There is an exponentially greater amount of corruption every time you add a level of power and authority. And that's what he's saying. And he's writing in a time, Solomon himself is at the top of a very sophisticated and very large bureaucracy. And so he knows what he's talking about. He is at the head of it. He is at the top of the pyramid. And he knows about the corruption that stands between him and the farmer cultivating his field. But then there's the flip side of that coin. This is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. In other words, if you have an enlightened leader who is committed to the prosperity of his land in general and the progress and the growth of the average citizen, that's good for everybody. It makes sense, even if you don't have a promise of heaven and hell, that your leaders would be so enlightened. But the truth about humanity is that they are not. And that's what he's telling us in verse 9. This is universal. If you have at the top of the pyramid, if your leader is committed to progress and the progress of everyone in his kingdom, then that's going to benefit everybody. It will benefit him. It'll benefit every level of society. But most rulers are not about investing; they're about extracting. And of course, that's that will produce diminishing returns all the time, and which will produce more corruption, more hardship on the backs of the poorest and the weakest people. Okay, we'll pick up with verse 10 next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.